and the focus of today's class is performance attribution. We will narrow down performance attribution by trying to analyze the fundamental factor model attribution analysis, which uses what we can call multi-factor models. And we can say that fundamental factor model attribution. Now, fundamental factor model attribution utilizes multi-factor models of the form y is equals to b naught plus b1 x1 plus b2 x2 b3 x3 plus bn xn plus an error term there. Now, these are multi-factor models, or this is a multi-factor model, and this represents the intercept. When x is 0, what is the value of y? It is an important component, especially in multi-factor model attribution, because it provides what is the risk if we do not have an independent variable over there. What is the risk of not having an independent variable? That is what we're saying is presented by this B naught component here. We're saying B1 is the factor sensitivity that relates to the first factor, factor sensitivity that relates to the second factor, factor sensitivity relates to the third factor, and so on and so forth. E, or the error term, like I explained in our previous lessons over here, that error, what is not explained by these independent variables, is explained by other factors that are not included in the model right there. And so we can say the following. What are the specific steps involved under fundamental factor model attribution? We are saying that fundamental factor model attribution should be possible to develop multi-factor models to conduct micro-attribution analysis. It involves combining economic sectors, this is important, with other fundamental factors, for example, company size, company characteristics, and etc. there. So, what does it involve? What is involved in fundamental factor model attribution? Factor model attribution. Fundamental factor model attribution. We can move over on this other side over here so that I cannot be able to struggle. You can be able to clearly see it over here. Step number 1. We're saying identify the factors that will generate returns. What do you think will generate returns? Which sectors will generate returns? What combinations of each sector will generate returns? That is what you're supposed to do under the first step over here. We identify the factors that will generate returns, period. Number 2, we determine the exposures of the portfolio. Determine the exposures of the portfolio. Determine the exposures of the portfolio and benchmark determine the exposures of the portfolio and the benchmark to fundamental factors. Like that. So what are we saying? We are saying that we determine the exposures of the portfolio and the benchmark to fundamental factors. And how do we do this? We just get the normal exposures and we less the actual exposures. So we get the normal exposures minus the actual exposures. to the factors. That. Step 3. We determine the manager's exposure. Determine the manager's exposure. We determine the manager's exposure to each factor. To each factor. Determine the manager's exposure to each factor. And rather, what I've done is that I've just interchanged them, pardon me. So we're saying under step 2, we determine the exposures of the portfolio and the benchmark to fundamental factors, to fundamental factors at the start. This should be at the start, and then this one comes right over here. Factors at the start. Pardon me, over there. So we just have to wrap this slightly, guys. Sorry about that. At the start is not the normal exposure, sorry about that. At the start, so we determine the exposures of the portfolio and benchmark to fundamental factors at the start. And then number 3 is where now we are saying we determine the manager's exposure. So determine the manager's exposure. Determine the manager's exposure to each factor. To each factor. And this is where I was saying previously over here in error, guys, please forgive me for that as well, that it is just given by the normal exposures minus the actual exposures. So I can come on this other side over here, say the normal exposures minus the actual exposures, normal exposures minus the actual exposures. That gives us, or that will enable us to determine the manager's exposure to each factor here. Normal versus the actual over there. Finally, number 4, determine the active impact. Determine the active impact. I.e., this is addressed. This is the added return, not the address. This is the added return due to the manager's active exposures. Due to the manager's active exposures. That. So we're saying determine. So this should be not determine, it's determine, pardon me. Determine the active impact, i.e., this is the added return due to the manager's active exposure. How unique was the manager's skill in trying to allocate funds to specific asset classes to generate excess return? So we determine the active impact, i.e., this is the added return due to the manager's active exposures there. And that is how we can be able to conduct a fundamental factor model attribution. This brings us to the end of this subsection that we call performance attribution. And in our next subsection, we will be able to discuss performance measurement there.